The coffee pot trembles in my grip, sending tiny ripples across the dark surface of the espresso as I watch the most dangerous man in New York slide into booth 7 with the casual grace of a panther who knows every other creature in the room exists solely at his mercy. And I realize with a sinking feeling in my chest that my carefully constructed invisible life is about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. His name is Konstantin Volkov, though no one in this restaurant would dare speak it aloud. And I know this not because anyone has told me, but because I have spent the last 3 years making it my mission to know exactly who to avoid, which faces belong to which organizations, and how to disappear into the background so thoroughly that men like him would never, ever notice a struggling waitress, whose only remarkable quality is her ability to refill water glasses without making a sound. I have been Isla Morvan, 24-year-old nobody, for exactly 1,097 days, and in that time I have perfected the art of being forgettable, of blending into the worn floorboards of Milano's upscale Italian restaurant, where the wealthy and dangerous come to conduct business over plates of ossobuco and bottles of wine that cost more than I make in a month. And not once has anyone looked at me with anything beyond mild irritation when their martini arrives 30 seconds later than expected. But tonight feels different in a way that makes my skin prickle with warning. And as I watch Konstantin's crew file in behind him, 6 men in expensive suits with the kind of bulges under their jackets that speak to concealed weapons and zero regard for metal detectors, I feel the weight of my past pressing against my carefully constructed present, like a knife blade testing the strength of thin ice. Table 7 is yours tonight, Isla, my manager Marco announces, with the kind of nervous energy that suggests he knows exactly who just walked through our doors and is desperately hoping that exceptional service will prevent his restaurant from becoming a crime scene. And I want to refuse, want to claim a sudden illness or a family emergency, or literally anything that would put distance between myself and the booth where Konstantin now sits, with his winter blue eyes scanning the room, like a predator cataloging potential threats. Instead, I nod, with the practiced subservience of someone who cannot afford to lose this job, straighten my black apron with hands that I force into steadiness through sheer willpower, and approach table 7 with my notepad ready, and my eyes carefully lowered in the universal language of staff, who understand their place in the hierarchy of power. "Good evening, gentlemen," I say in the neutral, professionally pleasant tone I have cultivated specifically for moments like these, when I need to be present but not memorable, helpful but not distinctive, and certainly not interesting enough to warrant a second glance from anyone at this table. "Can I start you off with something to drink? Or would you prefer a few moments to look at the wine list?" Konstantin doesn't look at me, which should be a relief, but somehow feels like a slight, and I realize with uncomfortable self-awareness that some treacherous part of my psychology is actually offended that this beautiful, terrifying man has dismissed my existence so completely, as if 3 years of deliberate invisibility have made me forget what it felt like to be seen. His second in command, a barrel-chested man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, orders vodka for the table in an accent thick with Moscow winters, and I scribble the request while keeping my expression blank, giving no indication that I understand every word of the Russian conversation already flowing around me like a river of secrets I am not supposed to comprehend. I bring their drinks on a silver tray, placing each glass with the careful precision of someone who has learned that invisible people must also be flawless people, and I am turning to leave when Konstantin's voice cuts through the air with a command issued in rapid, complex Russian that makes 2 of his men immediately tense. "The Beslin contract," he says, and my heart stops for precisely 3 seconds before I force it to resume beating, because that name, that specific collection of syllables, is a ghost I thought I had buried deep enough that it could never claw its way back to the surface. Where is the documentation, and why has no one been able to decipher the terms clearly enough to proceed? One of his men, younger than the others, with the eager desperation of someone trying to prove their value, produces a leather portfolio from his briefcase and slides it across the table toward Konstantin, with hands that shake just slightly. Betraying his nervousness, despite his attempt at confidence. "The agreement is written in Russian, boss," the young man explains in English now, perhaps aware that some of the crew are not native speakers. "But there are sections in another dialect we cannot identify, and our usual translator says it might be Chechen, but he cannot be certain. And without understanding these clauses completely, we risk walking into terms that could compromise the entire operation." Constantine opens the portfolio, with movements so controlled they border on theatrical. And I watch from my position near the server station as his eyes scan the pages, his expression shifting from focused concentration to barely contained frustration in the space of mere seconds. "This is unacceptable," he announces, his voice dropping to the kind of quiet that is somehow more terrifying than shouting, because it suggests a rage so profound that it has moved beyond the need for volume. "We have built an empire on the foundation of information, on knowing more than our enemies, on understanding every detail of every agreement before we sign our names and commit our resources, and you bring me a contract that none of you can fully translate?" The young man, who presented the documents, looks like he might vomit directly onto the pristine white tablecloth, and I feel an unwelcome flash of sympathy for him, because I know what it is like to disappoint powerful men, to fail to meet expectations, to face consequences that are disproportionate to the crime. "I will pay $1 million, Constantine declares suddenly, his voice rising now as he addresses not just his crew, but somehow the entire restaurant, the whole city, the universe itself. "To anyone who can accurately translate this document in its entirety, including the Chechen passages, and provide me with a complete understanding of every clause, every condition, and every potential trap that might be hidden in language barriers." His men exchange glances that range from skeptical to openly amused, and one of them, a graying man with the weathered face of someone who has survived decades in this brutal world, actually laughs. "Boss, with respect, you might as well offer 10 million, he says in Russian, assuming no one beyond their circle can understand, because no one in this restaurant, in this city probably, has the combination of skills required to decipher ancient Chechen dialects mixed with modern Russian contract law. And even if such a person existed, they would not be working as a waitress or a cook in a place like this." The other men join in the laughter, and Constantine himself cracks the smallest smile, though his eyes remain cold and calculating, as if he is already moving past this obstacle and planning alternative approaches to extracting the information he needs. And I should let this moment pass, should refill their water glasses and retreat to the kitchen and let them solve their own problems while I continue my 3-year streak of absolute anonymity. But I am staring at that portfolio from across the room, and I can see the elegant Cyrillic script, even at this distance, and beneath it, the older, more angular characters of a dialect I learned at my grandmother's knee during summers in a small village that no longer exists on any map. My grandmother, who taught me Chechen while braiding my hair and telling me stories of mountains and warriors, who made me promise to honor our language even as the world tried to erase it, who died believing that our words held power that transcended borders and politics, and the violent men who thought they could silence culture with bullets. My father, who built upon that foundation and taught me Russian, Italian, Mandarin, Arabic, and 6 other languages, who believed that communication was the key to preventing wars and protecting innocents, who worked as a translator for international intelligence until the day that work got him killed, along with my mother and my younger brother, in an explosion that was ruled accidental, but that I absolutely know was orchestrated by people who wanted to silence what he knew. I am walking toward table 7 before my conscious mind approves the decision, and my voice sounds strange in my own ears, too loud and too clear, lacking the careful neutrality I have weaponized for self-protection. "I can translate it," I hear myself say, and the words hang in the suddenly silent restaurant like a confession, like a declaration of war, like the ending of one life and the violent beginning of another. Every head at the table turns toward me with synchronized precision, and Constantine's ice-blue eyes lock onto mine with an intensity that feels like being pinned beneath a microscope, studied and dissected and evaluated for worth. and I realize with crystalline clarity that I have made a catastrophic mistake. You, he says slowly, his accent wrapping around the single syllable like barbed wire around flesh. A waitress in a second-tier Italian restaurant. Claim you can translate a document that has stumped every professional linguist my organization has consulted? His tone is not quite mocking, but carries the sharp edge of disbelief, mixed with something that might be curiosity, or might be the prelude to violence. And I know I should backtrack. Should laugh it off as a misunderstanding, or a moment of temporary insanity brought on by long shifts and too little sleep. But my grandmother's voice is echoing in my memory, telling me that our language deserves to be honored, that hiding our knowledge is its own form of erasure. I can read Chechen, I say with more confidence than I feel, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse hammers against my throat like a trapped bird. The old mountain dialect from the northeastern regions, and I am also fluent in Russian, Italian, English, and Mandarin, so yes, I believe I can provide you with a comprehensive translation that addresses every clause and every potential complication hidden in the language barriers. The silence that follows my declaration is so profound that I can hear the kitchen staff moving pots in the back room, can hear traffic on the street outside, can hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like an execution drum counting down my final moments. Then Constantine does something I do not expect. He smiles, and it is not the cold, calculated expression from before, but something genuine and almost delighted, as if I have presented him with an unexpected gift, or an intriguing puzzle that might actually prove challenging. Then prove yourself, Princessa, he says, his voice dropping to a purr that somehow feels more dangerous than his earlier anger, gesturing to the empty seat beside him with one elegant hand, while his men watch with expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. You have until sunrise to provide me with a complete translation, and if it is accurate and comprehensive, the $1 million is yours without question or condition. He pauses, and his smile sharpens into something that makes my survival instincts scream, warnings I am choosing to ignore. But if you are wasting my time, if this is some desperate bid for attention or money based on false claims, he continues, his eyes never leaving mine as he speaks with the casual certainty of someone who has ended lives for far lesser transgressions, then you will discover that I am significantly less generous with liars than I am with linguists, and your sunrise will be considerably less pleasant than you might hope. I should run, should apologize and claim temporary insanity, and beg for the mercy to return to my invisible life. But instead I reach for the portfolio with hands that no longer tremble, because I have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And as my fingers touch the leather cover, I feel the weight of every choice that led me to this moment, every loss I have survived, every skill I have hidden, every version of myself I have buried in pursuit of safety that was always an illusion. I will need a quiet space to work, adequate lighting, and access to reference materials if you have them, I say, with the professional efficiency of someone who has done this before, in another life, for other dangerous men who thought they could control information and therefore control the world. And I prefer to work alone, without supervision, because I concentrate better without an audience evaluating my every keystroke. Constantine studies me for a long moment that feels like an eternity, and I can see him recalculating his assessment, adjusting his understanding of who I am and what I might represent. And I know he will not let this go, will not allow me to simply translate his document and disappear back into obscurity, because men like him do not encounter mysteries without pursuing them to their ultimate conclusion. My penthouse, he says finally, standing from the booth with liquid grace and buttoning his suit jacket with movements that suggest this decision was inevitable, predetermined by forces neither of us fully control. You will work there, under guard, and you will complete this translation by dawn. And then, Isla Morven, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about how a waitress came to possess skills that most intelligence agencies would kill to acquire. He knows my name, has already investigated me in the minutes since I approached his table, and I realize that his network is faster and more comprehensive than I had feared. which means my carefully constructed background is already being torn apart by researchers who will eventually, inevitably, discover the inconsistencies and the gaps and the places where Isla Morven was created rather than born. The other patrons in the restaurant are studiously ignoring us now, understanding with the survival instincts of prey animals that whatever is happening at table 7 is beyond their concern and potentially lethal to observe too closely. And Marco has disappeared entirely, probably into his office where he can pretend he saw nothing and knows nothing if questioned later by police or competitors. I follow Constantine toward the exit with his men forming a loose perimeter around us, and as we step into the cold November night where 3 black SUVs wait at the curb like patient predators, I catch my reflection in the restaurant window and barely recognize the woman staring back at me. No longer invisible, no longer safe, no longer able to pretend that the past stays buried simply because we wish it so. "After you, Princessa," Constantine says, holding open the door to the middle vehicle with mock courtesy that cannot quite hide the steel underneath, and I slide into the leather interior knowing that when the sun rises, I will either be a millionaire or a corpse. And the terrifying part is that I am not entirely certain which outcome I should hope for, because both will irrevocably destroy the careful fiction of Isla Morven and force me to confront the truth of who I really am and what I am truly capable of becoming. The penthouse occupies the entire 52nd floor of a building in Tribeca that probably costs more per month than most people earn in a lifetime. And as the private elevator deposits us directly into Constantine's domain, with a soft chime that sounds almost apologetic for interrupting his fortress of wealth and power, I realize that I have entered a world so far removed from my cramped studio apartment in Queens that we might as well be on different planets orbiting different suns and galaxies that will never achieve meaningful contact. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcase Manhattan spreading out below us like a circuit board of lights and lives, each tiny point of illumination representing someone who is probably not currently being escorted by armed guards to translate documents for a man who could end their existence with a single phone call. And I feel a hysterical laugh building in my chest that I suppress through sheer force of will because showing weakness now would be catastrophic. "The office is through here," Constantine says, his hand settling against the small of my back, with a possessiveness that should offend me but instead sends an unwelcome current of electricity up my spine. And I hate myself a little bit for responding to his touch, when I should be focused entirely on survival and the impossible task I have claimed I can complete before sunrise. The office is all dark wood and leather, masculine and imposing, with a desk that looks like it was carved from a single massive tree and probably cost more than my entire year's salary at the restaurant. And Constantine gestures toward it with the casual authority of someone who has never questioned his right to command spaces and people with equal effectiveness. "You will work here," he instructs, moving to a cabinet and producing the leather portfolio along with several other documents I had not seen at the restaurant, spreading them across the desk's surface with careful precision. That suggests he takes his business seriously, even when dealing with unexpected waitresses who make impossible claims. These are supplementary materials, previous contracts with similar parties, background on the people involved, contextual information that might help you understand references that could be unclear without broader knowledge of the situation. I approach the desk with the careful steps of someone entering a cage with a wild animal, hyper-aware that 2 of Constantine's men have positioned themselves by the door with the kind of relaxed vigilance that suggests they could go from stationary to lethal in less than a second. And I wonder if they are there to prevent me from leaving or to prevent anyone else from entering, and which scenario would actually be more comforting. "I need my laptop," I say, then immediately regret the words, because admitting I own a laptop that is likely far more sophisticated than a struggling waitress should possess is another crack in my carefully constructed cover story. But Constantine merely nods as if this is entirely expected. "Dmitri will accompany you to retrieve whatever you need," he says, gesturing to the younger man who brought the original documents to the restaurant. And I can see the assignment is both a test of Dmitri's reliability and a message to me that I will not be moving through this city without Volkov oversight until this situation reaches whatever conclusion Constantine has already decided upon. The drive to my apartment takes 23 minutes through late-night traffic, and Dmitri spends the entire journey watching me with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation that does not quite balance, and I know he is cataloging every detail about me for later reporting to his boss, noting the way I hold myself, the neighborhood where I live, the things I do not say in response to his carefully casual questions about how long I have worked at Milano's and whether I have always been interested in languages. Languages chose me more than I chose them, I tell him, which is true enough to pass casual scrutiny while revealing absolutely nothing of substance, and I can see his frustration at my evasiveness. But he is professional enough not to push, understanding perhaps that Constantine has claimed the right to interrogate me, and that overstepping would not be appreciated. My apartment is exactly as I left it, small, neat, aggressively impersonal except for the books that line every available surface, dictionaries and grammars and literature in a dozen languages that represent the one luxury I allow myself in this carefully budgeted existence. And I watch Dmitri's eyes widen slightly as he takes in the scope of my collection, understanding dawning that perhaps I was not exaggerating my linguistic capabilities after all. I retrieve my laptop from its hiding place in a locked drawer, along with the external hard drive that contains resources I should not possess, reference materials and glossaries and encrypted files from a life I am supposed to have left behind. And I catch Dmitri staring at the sophisticated security setup I have installed on a device that should be a cheap consumer model, bought from whatever electronics store offers the best price. I value my privacy, I say with a shrug that I hope conveys eccentric caution rather than professional paranoia. And he nods slowly, filing away this detail with all the others he will present to Constantine like offerings at an altar. And I wonder how long I have before the accumulated weight of inconsistencies collapses my cover story entirely. Back at the penthouse, I settle into the leather chair behind Constantine's desk with my laptop open and the documents arranged in the order I will need to reference them, and I am aware of his presence even though he has retreated to the sitting area, where he conducts a series of phone calls in Russian that I understand perfectly, but pretend not to hear, discussing shipments and territories and problems with suppliers who are not meeting expectations and will need to be replaced or eliminated depending on the severity of their failures. The document itself is a masterwork of intentional obfuscation, written by someone who understood that multiple language layers would create barriers to easy comprehension and therefore provide plausible deniability if terms needed to be disputed later. And I can appreciate the strategy even as I recognize the danger it represents to Constantine's organization if he agrees to conditions he does not fully understand. The Russian portions are straightforward enough, standard contract language governing the sale and transport of what the document euphemistically refers to as agricultural equipment, but which I suspect are weapons based on the specifications and the parties involved, and I work through these sections with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has translated hundreds of similar documents in previous lives and other identities. But the Chechen passages are where the real complexity lives, written in the old northeastern dialect that my grandmother spoke with the particular inflections of her specific village. And as I read the angular script that flows across the page like a river finding its path through ancient stones, I hear her voice in my memory, teaching me that language is not just communication, but identity. Not just words, but the soul of a people who refuse to be erased by history or violence, or the passage of time that grinds cultures into dust. The clauses hidden in Chechen are the poison pills, the traps that would give Constantine's counterparty the ability to claim breach of contract under circumstances that are vague enough to be interpreted, however serves their interests. And I realize that whoever drafted this agreement was counting on the language barrier to obscure terms that no reasonable person would accept if they understood the full implications. I work through the night with a focus that erases everything beyond the screen and the documents and the steady accumulation of translated text, creating 4 separate versions, one in Russian for Constantine's native comprehension, one in Italian because I notice some of his crew are more comfortable in that language based on their earlier conversations, one in English as the international standard for business, and one in Mandarin because I suspect Constantine's organization has connections in Asia that might need to review these terms independently. Hours dissolve into the rhythm of translation, that particular mental state where I am not thinking in any single language but rather existing in the spaces between them, understanding meaning at a level that transcends specific words and touches something more fundamental about human communication and the ways we try to encode truth and deception into symbols on a page. "You have not moved in 3 hours," Constantine's voice interrupts my concentration, and I look up to find him standing beside the desk with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he places before me with a gesture that is almost gentle, almost concerned. And I realize dawn is approaching based on the way darkness is beginning to surrender to gray light at the edges of the Manhattan skyline. "Translation requires sustained focus," I explain, accepting the coffee and wrapping my hands around the cup's warmth, suddenly aware that the office has grown cold, or perhaps I have simply been too absorbed to notice my body's discomfort until this moment of forced pause. Breaking concentration means losing the flow of meaning across languages, missing nuances that might seem insignificant but could alter interpretations in critical ways. He settles into the chair across from the desk, studying me with an expression I cannot quite read, something between admiration and suspicion, and a third emotion that might be attraction, but could also be the predatory interest of someone who has identified prey worth the effort of a prolonged hunt. "Tell me how a waitress learns to translate ancient Chechen dialects," he says, and it is phrased as a request, but carries the weight of a command. And I know this is the interrogation I have been anticipating since the moment I opened my mouth at the restaurant and shattered 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility. "My grandmother was Chechen," I answer, offering him the truth that costs me least, the facts that can be verified through basic research, and therefore cannot be denied. She taught me her language because she believed it was disappearing, that her grandchildren might be the last generation to speak it fluently, and she wanted to preserve something of her culture through us. "And the other languages?" he presses, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between us in a way that feels both threatening and intimate. "Russian, Italian, Mandarin, these are not casual acquisitions, not hobbies someone pursues in their spare time between restaurant shifts." "My father was a linguist," I continue, walking the razor's edge between revelation and concealment, giving him enough truth to satisfy immediate curiosity, while hiding the details that would expose everything. He believed language was the key to understanding, that if people could truly communicate across cultural barriers, many of the world's conflicts could be prevented, or at least better managed. Was? Constantine catches the past tense with the precision of someone who listens for weaknesses and inconsistencies in every conversation. "Your father is dead?" "My whole family is dead," I say, and the words come out harder than I intend, carrying 3 years of grief that I have not allowed myself to process, because processing means remembering, and remembering means feeling, and feeling is a luxury I cannot afford when survival requires constant vigilance. Car accident 3 years ago, killed my parents and my younger brother, left me alone with a collection of languages and no family to share them with. It is close enough to the truth to carry emotional authenticity, different enough from the reality to hopefully prevent him from making connections I cannot afford him to make. And I watch his expression shift into something that might be sympathy, except that men like Konstantin Volkov probably learned to weaponize sympathy long before they learned genuine compassion. "I am sorry for your loss," he says with what sounds like sincerity, though I cannot be certain whether he means it, or whether he is simply skilled at manufacturing appropriate emotional responses. Family is everything, the foundation upon which we build our lives, and losing that foundation leaves us unmoored in ways that others cannot fully comprehend. The moment of shared grief, or performed grief, or whatever this exchange actually represents, stretches between us like a bridge that neither of us quite trusts to bear weight. And then I break it by returning my attention to the laptop and the final sections of translation that require completion before sunrise arrives, and my deadline expires. I am nearly finished, I announce, my fingers moving across the keyboard with renewed purpose. Another 30 minutes, and you will have comprehensive translations in all 4 languages, along with annotations highlighting the problematic clauses that are designed to create future complications for your organization. He stands and moves behind the desk, close enough that I can feel the heat of his body and smell the expensive cologne that probably costs more than my monthly rent. And he reads over my shoulder in silence, his eyes tracking across the screen as I finalize the Mandarin version with the same meticulous attention to detail I have applied to the other 3. This clause here, he says, pointing to a section I have highlighted in red. Explain the trap you have identified. The Chechen text creates an obligation to provide continuous access to transport infrastructure, which sounds reasonable on the surface, I explain, falling into the professional rhythm of intelligence briefing that I learned in another life. But the specific phrasing in the old dialect actually extends this to mean that your counterparty can demand use of any vehicle, any route, any facility your organization controls, at any time, for any purpose, without advance notice and without your ability to refuse, which essentially gives them unlimited access to your entire logistical network and the ability to compromise your operations or expose your activities to law enforcement or rival organizations whenever they choose. Constantine's expression darkens as he absorbs the implications, and I can see the rage building behind his carefully controlled exterior, the fury of someone who prides himself on never being deceived and who has just confronted evidence that he nearly walked into a trap that could have destroyed everything he has built. They thought I would not understand, he says quietly, his voice carrying the particular quality of anger that has moved beyond heat into something colder and more dangerous. They counted on the language barrier to hide their intentions, to make me complicit in my own downfall. Most people underestimate the importance of accurate translation, I offer, hitting the final keys that complete my work and sending all 4 documents to the printer that hums to life in the corner of the office. They treat language as a simple code, where words map one-to-one across cultural boundaries, when in reality, every language carries assumptions and implications that can completely alter meaning in ways that dictionaries cannot capture. I gather the printed pages and arrange them in 4 neat stacks, each version complete with my annotations and explanatory notes, each one representing hours of concentrated effort and the application of skills I have spent 3 years pretending not to possess, and I slide them across the desk toward Constantine with the satisfaction of work completed to the highest possible standard. Your translation, as requested, I say formally, comprehensive, accurate, and annotated to highlight areas of concern, delivered before sunrise as specified in our agreement. He picks up the Russian version and reads through it with complete focus, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages, while I sit in silence and wait for verdict or execution or whatever comes next in this interaction that has already spiraled so far beyond my control that I can only ride the current and hope it does not pull me under entirely. 6 minutes pass in absolute quiet before he sets down the papers and looks at me with an expression I cannot decipher, something between respect and calculation, and a decision being made that will alter the trajectory of both our lives in ways neither of us can fully anticipate. You have earned your $1 million, he announces, gesturing to Dmitri, who has materialized in the doorway, as if summoned by some signal I did not perceive. Have the cash prepared immediately. Dmitri nods and disappears, and I should feel relief or triumph, or at least satisfaction that I have successfully navigated this impossible situation and will walk away substantially wealthier than I was 12 hours ago. But instead I feel a creeping dread, because Constantine is still watching me with that unsettling intensity that suggests this transaction is far from complete. However, he continues, and that single word drops into the space between us like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence in all directions. I find myself facing a new problem, which is that I now possess evidence of your extraordinary capabilities, and I cannot simply allow you to return to your restaurant and your invisible life as if this night never happened. He stands and walks to the windows where, Dawn is finally breaking over Manhattan in shades of pink and gold, and he speaks to the city rather than to me, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I am offering you a position as my personal translator," he says, his tone making it clear this is not actually an offer but rather a statement of how our future will unfold. 3 months at $100,000 per month, during which time you will handle all sensitive communications for my organization, translate all documents that require linguistic expertise, and make yourself available whenever your skills are needed. "And if I refuse?" I ask, though I already know the answer, can already see the trap closing around me with the inexorable logic of consequences following choices. He turns from the window and his smile is beautiful and terrible, the expression of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for his opponent to acknowledge defeat. "Then I will be forced to investigate why someone with your remarkable talents has been hiding as a waitress for 3 years, he says softly, walking back toward the desk with predatory grace. "And I suspect that investigation will uncover information that you would very much prefer to remain buried, and that the people you have been hiding from will suddenly discover exactly where to find Isla Morven, if that is even your real name." The threat is delivered with perfect courtesy, wrapped in the language of business proposition. But the steel underneath is unmistakable, and I understand with absolute clarity that he has seen through my carefully constructed cover, not completely, but enough to know that I am someone worth investigating, someone with secrets worth exposing, someone who cannot afford the scrutiny his resources would bring to bear. "I translate," I say, laying out the only boundary I can hope to enforce. "I provide linguistic services, nothing more. I do not participate in violence. I do not facilitate illegal activities beyond the translation work itself. And you do not ask questions about my past or investigate my background or interfere in my life beyond the scope of this professional arrangement." His laugh is genuine and carries a note of delighted surprise, as if I have proven to be even more interesting than he initially suspected, and he extends his hand across the desk in a gesture that is simultaneously a business agreement and a claiming. "We will see how long those boundaries last, Isla Morven," he says, and when I place my hand in his to seal this devil's bargain, his fingers close around mine with warmth that spreads up my arm and into my chest, where it tangles with fear and anger and something that might be exhilaration at finally, after 3 years of hiding, being truly seen by someone, even if that someone is exactly the kind of dangerous man I should be running from rather than binding myself to. But I accept your terms for now, and I very much look forward to discovering who you really are beneath all these carefully constructed layers of deception. Dmitri returns with a briefcase that he sets on the desk and opens to reveal stacks of $100 bills arranged with meticulous precision. $1 million in cash that represents both payment for services rendered and the first installment of a salary that will keep me tethered to Constantine's world for at least the next 3 months. And I stare at the money, understanding that I am looking at both salvation and damnation wrapped in the same paper bands. "Welcome to the Volkov Bratva, Princessa," Constantine says, releasing my hand but not my gaze, his ice-blue eyes holding mine with an intensity that makes me feel simultaneously exposed and protected, hunted and claimed. "I have a feeling you are going to prove far more valuable than even you currently understand, and I am very much looking forward to exploring exactly what other secrets that brilliant mind of yours is hiding behind those carefully neutral expressions and those languages you wield like weapons most people do not even recognize." 3 weeks of working for the Volkov Bratva have taught me that violence has its own language, a vocabulary of glances and silences, and the particular way men shift their weight when they are preparing to do something irreversible. And I am becoming fluent in this terrible dialect despite every intention I had to remain nothing more than a linguistic intermediary who processes words without absorbing the darkness that saturates them, like blood soaking into expensive carpet. The translation work itself is exactly what Constantine promised. Endless streams of communications requiring my expertise, everything from intercepted phone conversations between rival organizations that need to be transcribed and analyzed for hidden meanings, to love letters from his lieutenants, to their mistresses that must be rendered into languages their wives do not speak. And I find a perverse comfort in the routine, even as I recognize that I am becoming complicit in an empire built on fear and money and the systematic application of brutality to maintain order. My new office is located in a building Constantine owns in Lower Manhattan, 3 floors dedicated to what he euphemistically calls business operations, but which I quickly learn encompasses everything from legitimate import-export companies that serve as fronts for less legal activities, to the coordination of protection rackets and gambling enterprises and other ventures that exist in the shadows between legality and outright criminality. And I occupy a corner suite with windows overlooking the Hudson River, and enough security that I feel simultaneously protected and imprisoned. Dmitri has become something like an assistant, or perhaps a handler. I am never quite certain which role he is actually fulfilling. And he brings me documents in the morning with coffee prepared exactly how I prefer it, even though I never told him my preferences. And he collects my completed translations in the evening, with the kind of careful efficiency that suggests he is also monitoring my productivity and reporting back to Constantine on whether his investment in my skills is yielding appropriate returns. "Heavy workload today," Dmitri announces as he enters my office carrying a stack of folders that look substantial even by the standards I have become accustomed to, and he sets them on my desk with an apologetic expression that I have learned means the material is either particularly sensitive or unusually urgent, or both. The boss needs the Markov negotiations translated by tonight, and there are intercepted communications from the Beslin network that require immediate attention. The name Beslin still sends ice through my veins every time I hear it. Still resurrects memories I have spent 3 years trying to bury deep enough that they cannot claw their way back to consciousness, and I take the folders with hands that I force into steadiness because showing any reaction to that particular collection of syllables would invite questions I absolutely cannot answer. "I will prioritize accordingly," I tell Dmitri with professional neutrality, opening the first folder and scanning its contents, while he lingers in the doorway as if waiting for something. And I look up to find him watching me with an expression that carries concern, or perhaps curiosity, about why a translator would need the kind of combat training that I accidentally revealed last week, when someone came up behind me unexpectedly, and I responded with defensive maneuvers that are absolutely not part of any waitress's skill set. "The boss wants to see you tonight after you finish," Dmitri adds, his tone carefully casual in a way that suggests this summons is significant. "He said to tell you it is not about the work, that your translations have been exemplary, but that there is a matter he wishes to discuss that requires your particular expertise." I nod, acknowledgement, and return my attention to the documents, dismissing Dmitri through body language that I have perfected over weeks of establishing boundaries that prevent too much familiarity or too many personal questions. And I hear him leave with the soft click of my office door that signals I am alone again with words and their infinite capacity to conceal and reveal truth in equal measure. The Markov negotiations are straightforward enough. Standard territory disputes between Konstantin's organization and a smaller crew that is trying to expand into areas that the Volkov Bratva considers exclusively theirs. And I translate the back-and-forth communications with the mechanical precision of someone who has learned not to think too deeply about the implications of the words I am processing, about the violence that lurks beneath the formal language of business proposals and counteroffers. But the Beslin intercepts are different, are dangerous in ways that make my pulse accelerate, and my hands tremble slightly as I read through conversations that reveal an organization I know far too well, that speak about operations I recognize from my father's work, that mention names of people who are either dead or should be if there is any justice in a universe that increasingly seems designed to reward cruelty and punish those who try to do the right thing. I am reading an intercepted email written in Chechen when I see it, a reference to the linguist's daughter, and a directive to continue searching for her, because she possesses information that could compromise multiple operations, and therefore must be found and neutralized before she can share what she knows with authorities or rival organizations. and my blood turns to ice as I realize they are talking about me, are still hunting for me 3 years after they killed my family, still believe I have access to my father's files and his networks and his secrets. My father, who worked as a translator for international intelligence agencies, who believed he was helping prevent conflicts and protect innocents, who discovered through his work that certain organizations were collaborating across borders in ways that implicated government officials and business leaders and supposedly legitimate enterprises in networks of trafficking and weapons sales and corruption that reached into the highest levels of power. My father, who made the catastrophic mistake of believing that exposing this corruption would lead to justice rather than his murder, who compiled evidence and prepared to testify, who thought he could protect his family by keeping us separate from his work, when in reality, our connection to him made us targets from the moment he decided truth was worth dying for. The explosion that killed my parents and my brother was designed to look like an accident, a gas leak in our home that investigators ruled as tragic but not suspicious. And I survived only because I was at university that day. Only because random chance placed me in a library studying for exams instead of in the house, when it was transformed into an inferno that left nothing behind but ashes and questions that no one in authority seemed interested in pursuing. I have spent 3 years believing that my family's killers thought I died with them, that the incomplete remains recovered from the wreckage were sufficient to convince them that the linguist's entire bloodline had been erased. But this intercepted communication proves I was wrong, proves they know I survived, proves they have been searching for me with the patient persistence of predators who understand that prey eventually makes mistakes. You look like you have seen a ghost. Constantine's voice interrupts my spiraling thoughts, and I look up to find him standing in my office doorway with an expression of concern that seems genuine, but could also be the careful performance of someone who has learned that appearing to care is an effective tool for manipulation. Dmitri said you required immediate consultation on the Beslin materials. I did not call Dmitri, did not request any such consultation, which means either my reactions to the intercepted communications were visible enough to alarm him, or the office is monitored in ways I have not detected. And I realize with uncomfortable clarity that my privacy here is an illusion, maintained only as long as Constantine chooses to maintain it. The intercepts reference an ongoing search for someone they call the linguist's daughter. I say, deciding that partial truth is safer than complete concealment now that he is clearly aware something in these documents has disturbed me. And the language suggests they believe this person has information that poses a significant threat to their operations. Constantine enters the office fully and closes the door behind him, with a quiet finality that makes the space feel suddenly smaller, more intimate, more dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the way his presence seems to fill every available molecule of air with an intensity that makes it difficult to breathe normally. And you believe you know who this linguist's daughter might be, he says, moving to stand beside my desk where he can see my laptop screen and the translated intercepts displayed there. Or perhaps you are concerned that their search might somehow interfere with your own carefully hidden past. His perceptiveness is terrifying and compelling in equal measure, and I realize he has been observing me far more closely than I understood, cataloging my reactions and my skills and the inconsistencies in my cover story with the patient attention of someone assembling a puzzle from scattered pieces. I am concerned that if they are searching this aggressively, they might cast a wide enough net to catch people who have nothing to do with their actual target. I answer carefully, offering him an explanation that is true without being complete. And I prefer to avoid any situation that might draw unwanted attention to my existence. He studies me for a long moment with those ice-blue eyes that seem to see through every defense I have constructed, and then he does something unexpected. He reaches out and places his hand over mine where it rests on the desk, his touch warm and steady and strangely comforting, despite the fact that he represents exactly the kind of danger I should be fleeing. You will continue translating these intercepts, he instructs, his voice carrying an edge of command that brooks no argument. And you will provide me with complete intelligence on Beslin's operations, his networks, his vulnerabilities, because I have my own reasons for wanting to understand and ultimately destroy his organization. Why? I ask before I can stop myself, genuinely curious about what would motivate Constantine to target Beslin specifically, when there are dozens of rival organizations competing for territory and resources in this city. Because David Beslin has been undermining my operations for 3 years, Constantine says, his expression hardening into something that speaks to old grievances and carefully nurtured hatred. Stealing my shipments, corrupting my contacts, spreading lies about the reliability of Volkov business dealings, and I have been waiting for an opportunity to move against him decisively. And your linguistic skills might finally provide me with the intelligence I need to cut out this cancer before it spreads further. The coincidence is too perfect, too aligned with my own need for vengeance against the man who ordered my family's execution. And I wonder if perhaps the universe is not random chaos, but rather a carefully orchestrated series of collisions designed to bring certain people together at precisely the moment when their individual purposes align into something more powerful than either could achieve alone. I will translate everything, I promise, and I can hear the intensity in my own voice. The barely controlled rage that I have suppressed for 3 years suddenly finding an outlet in this unexpected alliance. I will find every weakness, every vulnerability, every piece of leverage that exists in these communications, and I will help you destroy him. Constantine's expression shifts into something that might be satisfaction, or might be the recognition of a kindred spirit. Someone else who understands that some debts can only be paid in blood, and that justice delayed is not justice denied, but rather justice that has been accumulating interest until the final reckoning becomes exponentially more devastating. Then we understand each other, he says softly, his hand still covering mine in a gesture that has transformed from comfort into something more like a pact. A binding agreement sealed not with signatures, but with shared purpose. And perhaps when this is finished, you will trust me enough to tell me the real reason why the mention of Beslin's name makes your hands shake and your eyes go dark with a hatred that only personal loss can create. Before I can respond, before I can deflect or deny or construct another layer of protective deception, the office door opens, and one of Constantine's senior lieutenants enters with an urgency that suggests immediate crisis rather than routine business. "Boss, we have a situation," the man announces in Russian, apparently assuming I do not understand or not caring if I do. "Markov's crew just hit one of our warehouses in Red Hook, killed 3 of our men, and took a shipment worth $2 million, and they are demanding we cede territory in Brooklyn, or they will continue attacking our operations." Constantine's demeanor changes instantly, the brief moment of connection between us evaporating as he shifts into the role of leader who must respond to challenges with decisive action. And I watch him transform from the man who was holding my hand to the apex, predator who has built an empire through strategic violence and unwavering determination. "Assemble the crew," he orders, his voice dropping into a register that carries absolute authority. "I want everyone at the warehouse in Red Hook within the hour, and bring Markov's messenger, the one who delivered their demands. We are going to send a response that leaves no ambiguity about how the Volkov Bratva handles thieves and murderers." The lieutenant nods and disappears, and Constantine turns back to me with an expression I cannot quite read, something between apology and invitation. And when he speaks, his words carry a weight that suggests this moment will alter the trajectory of everything that follows. "Come with me," he says, and it is phrased as a request, but carries the undertone of expectation. "I want you there for the interrogation, to translate if necessary, but also because I suspect you need to see what this world actually looks like when the polite fiction of business negotiations gives way to the reality of how power is actually maintained and enforced. I should refuse, should insist that my role is purely linguistic and does not extend to witnessing whatever brutality he is planning to inflict on Markov's messenger. But instead I find myself standing and closing my laptop and following Constantine out of the office because some part of me recognizes that he is offering me something more valuable than protection or money. He is offering me the truth about who he is and what he does, giving me the choice to accept or reject him with full knowledge rather than comfortable ignorance. The warehouse in Red Hook is exactly what I expected. Vast and cold, and smelling of metal and oil and something else that might be blood or might be my imagination supplying details my conscious mind does not want to acknowledge. And Constantine's crew has assembled with the grim efficiency of soldiers preparing for battle. 30 men in dark clothing with weapons, visible and expressions that suggest violence is not a possibility, but rather an inevitability. The messenger, a young man who cannot be more than 25 with the kind of cocky confidence that comes from not yet understanding how quickly life can be taken away, is bound to a chair in the center of the warehouse floor, with duct tape securing his wrists and ankles. And I can see the moment his bravado begins to crack, as he realizes that delivering Markov's demands might have been the last mistake he will ever make. "Tell Markov's dog what happens to people who kill Volkov men," Konstantin instructs one of his lieutenants in Russian, and I watch as the message is delivered with fists and boots and methodical brutality that is designed not to kill immediately, but rather to break body and spirit through sustained application of pain. I should look away, should close my eyes or leave the warehouse or do anything except stand here witnessing this violence with the same clinical detachment I apply to translating documents. But instead I watch with a strange sense of recognition, understanding that this is the world my father tried to fight against. The machinery of power that operates through fear and force and the willingness to do terrible things to maintain control. The messenger is screaming now, begging for mercy in a mixture of English and Russian that I translate automatically in my mind, even though no one has asked for linguistic services. And I realize with uncomfortable self-awareness that I am not horrified by what I am witnessing, but rather am analyzing it, cataloging the techniques being used, noting the psychological impact of sustained violence on both victim and observers. Constantine appears beside me with the silent grace of someone who has learned to move without disturbing the air, and he watches my face rather than the interrogation, studying my reactions with the same intensity he applied to reading my translations. "You are not frightened," he observes, his voice pitched low enough that only I can hear over the sounds of violence echoing through the warehouse. "And you are not disgusted or shocked, or any of the reactions most people would have to witnessing this level of brutality, which tells me that you have seen violence before, that somewhere in your carefully hidden past you were exposed to situations that taught you how to disconnect emotion from observation. My father's work sometimes brought violence to our doorstep," I answer with partial truth, giving him enough to satisfy his immediate curiosity, while concealing the full extent of what I witnessed growing up in a household where translation services for intelligence agencies meant that our home was occasionally a safe house for people fleeing exactly the kind of organizations that Constantine represents. And I learned early that showing fear or disgust only makes predators more interested in testing your limits. He nods slowly, and I can see him filing this information away with everything else he has learned about me, constructing a more complete picture of who I am beneath the layers of deception I have wrapped around myself like armor. The interrogation continues for another 20 minutes before Markov's messenger finally breaks completely and reveals the location where the stolen shipment is being held and the names of everyone involved in the warehouse attack. And I watch as Constantine's expression shifts from cold fury into something that might be satisfaction at having extracted useful intelligence through the brutal but effective application of force. "Send him back to Markov," Konstantin orders, his voice carrying across the warehouse with absolute clarity. "But first make sure he understands the message. For every Volkov man killed, we will take 10 of theirs, and for every dollar stolen, we will burn 100,000 of their assets. And this is not negotiation, but rather a statement of mathematical certainty about what happens when people mistake our patience for weakness." The messenger is cut free and collapses to the concrete floor, sobbing and broken, and 2 of Constantine's men drag him toward a van that will presumably deliver him and Constantine's message back to Markov with the kind of clarity that only comes from experiencing consequences rather than merely being told about them. Constantine turns to me, and in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the warehouse, I can see something in his expression that might be concern, or might be challenge, testing whether I will recoil from what I have witnessed, or whether I will prove capable of accepting the full reality of the world I have entered. "Now you know what I am," he says quietly, his hand reaching out to touch my face with a gentleness that seems impossible from someone who just orchestrated systematic torture. "Now you have seen the violence that underlies every negotiation, every business deal, every moment of the empire I have built, and you have a choice. You can walk away tonight with your 3-month salary and disappear back into whatever life you were living before, or you can stay and accept that working for me means being complicit in all of this darkness. I should choose safety, should take the money and run as far and as fast as possible from Konstantin Volkov and his world of brutality and blood. But instead I find myself leaning into his touch, find myself speaking words that I know will irrevocably bind me to him and his empire and the consequences that will follow. I am not walking away, I tell him, my voice steady and certain, despite the chaos of emotions swirling beneath my carefully controlled exterior. Because the man you want to destroy is the same man who murdered my family, and I will translate every word, witness every interrogation, and become as complicit in your darkness as necessary, if it means I finally get the chance to watch David Beslin pay for what he took from me. The warehouse goes absolutely silent as my confession hangs in the air between us, and I watch Konstantin's eyes widen with understanding and something that might be respect, or might be the recognition that he has just gained an ally whose motivation for vengeance matches his own. And when he pulls me against him in an embrace that feels simultaneously protective and possessive, I do not resist because I have just crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed, have just admitted to the most dangerous man in New York that I am not who I claim to be, and that my presence in his life is not accident, but rather fate, bringing together two people whose individual purposes have aligned into something that will reshape the landscape of organized crime in this city. Then we destroy him together. "Princessa," Konstantin whispers against my hair, his arms tightening around me with a fierceness that speaks to promises being made and boundaries being dissolved. "And I will teach you every word in the vocabulary of vengeance until you are fluent in the language of retribution, and together we will make David Beslin understand that some debts can only be paid in blood and screaming, and the complete annihilation of everything he has built on the graves of innocent people." The moment David Beslin walks into Konstantin's conference room with his entourage of armed men and his expression of carefully calculated arrogance, my entire world narrows to a pinpoint of crystalline focus, where every breath becomes a conscious effort to maintain the mask of professional neutrality, while my body screams at me to run, or fight, or do anything except stand here translating the words of the man who orchestrated my family's murder, as if he is just another client requiring linguistic services, rather than the architect of every nightmare that has haunted my sleep for 3 years. He looks exactly as I remember from the photographs my father kept in his encrypted files, the images I studied obsessively in the weeks after the explosion when I was trying to understand who had destroyed my family and why. And seeing him in person, breathing the same air, occupying the same physical space, creates a visceral reaction that I have to suppress through sheer force of will, because showing any recognition would unravel everything I have built, and potentially get both Konstantin and myself killed before we can execute the careful plan we have been constructing over the past 2 weeks. "Mr. Volkov," Beslin says in thickly accented English as he settles into the chair across from Konstantin, with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes he holds all the leverage in this negotiation. "I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting, as I believe we have much to discuss regarding our mutual interests in the Northeastern Corridor and the potential for collaboration that could benefit both our organizations substantially." Konstantin gestures toward me with a casual wave that belies the sigh tension I can feel radiating from his body, and his voice carries the perfect blend of professional courtesy and subtle dominance as he makes the introduction that will either save us or destroy us, depending on how well I can perform the role we have rehearsed. "This is Isla, my personal translator," he explains in English before switching to Russian for Beslin's benefit, knowing that the Chechen arms dealer prefers to negotiate in his second language rather than struggle with English. She will be facilitating our communication today to ensure that nothing is lost in translation and that we both understand the precise terms of any agreements we might reach. Beslin's eyes slide over me with the dismissive assessment of someone who has never considered that a woman in a professional capacity might be anything other than decoration or distraction. And I feel a flash of savage satisfaction knowing that his underestimation will be one of the many mistakes that contributes to his eventual downfall, because men who cannot see women as threats are men who leave themselves vulnerable to attacks they never anticipate. Very well, Beslin agrees in Russian, his tone suggesting he finds the presence of a translator to be an unnecessary formality, but is willing to indulge Konstantin's preferences. Then let us begin with the matter of the shipment that was intercepted last month by your people, which I believe contains materials that rightfully belong to my organization, and which I would like returned along with compensation for the disruption to my business operations. I translate his words into English for Konstantin's supposed benefit. Though I know he understands Russian perfectly well and is using my presence as both cover for additional observation and as a way to buy time to formulate responses while I perform my linguistic duties, and I maintain the neutral professional tone of someone who is merely a conduit for communication, rather than someone whose heart is hammering against her ribs with the effort of remaining calm while sitting 3 feet away from her family's murderer. The negotiation continues for 40 minutes, with both men dancing around the real issues, while I translate back and forth between Russian and English. And I am hyper-aware of every word Beslin speaks, listening not just to the surface meaning, but to the undertones and implications, and the small verbal tics that might reveal information useful to our larger purpose of destroying him completely. Then Beslin shifts the conversation in a direction that makes my blood turn to ice, and I realize with horrible clarity that the universe has a cruel sense of timing, because the words coming out of his mouth are the exact words I have been dreading since the moment he walked through the door. There is one other matter I wish to discuss, he says in Chechen now, apparently testing whether Konstantin's translator actually possesses the linguistic range she claims, which is the ongoing search for certain information that was compiled by a translator who worked for various intelligence agencies before his untimely death 3 years ago. And I have reason to believe that his daughter survived the accident that killed the rest of the family and may possess access to files that could prove problematic for several organizations, including potentially yours, Mr. Volkov. Every cell in my body is screaming danger as I process his words, and I know that this is the moment where I have to make a choice that will determine not just my fate, but Konstantin's as well. Because if I translate Beslin's statement accurately, then I reveal that I understand Chechen, and potentially invite questions about my background that I cannot afford to answer. But if I refuse to translate or claim I do not understand, then I expose our deception and suggest that we have something to hide. The decision crystallizes in my mind with the absolute clarity of someone who has already lost everything once, and has decided that surviving is less important than ensuring that the person responsible for that loss pays the appropriate price. And I look directly at Beslin as I prepare to make the most dangerous gamble of my life. Mr. Beslin is inquiring about intelligence files compiled by a deceased translator, I say to Konstantin in English, deliberately omitting the specific details about the translator's daughter and the ongoing search, subtly altering the meaning in a way that I know Beslin will not immediately detect, because he assumes I am faithfully rendering his words rather than strategically editing them to serve purposes he cannot comprehend. And he suggests that these files might contain information relevant to your operations and wonders if you have encountered any such materials in your business dealings. I watch Konstantin's face for any sign that he has detected my deviation from accurate translation, and I see the briefest flicker of something in his ice-blue eyes that might be understanding or might be warning. But he follows my lead with the smooth confidence of someone who trusts his instincts about when to pursue truth and when to allow deception to run its course. But Beslin is not a man who has survived decades in one of the world's most dangerous professions by being careless or inattentive, and I see his expression shift almost imperceptibly as he processes the exchange. his eyes narrowing slightly as he looks between Constantine and myself, with the beginning of suspicion that suggests my translation may not have been as seamless as I hoped. "That is not precisely what I said," Beslin observes in Chechen, his voice taking on an edge that makes the armed men standing behind him shift their weight in preparation for potential violence. And I am curious why a translator would choose to summarize rather than provide word-for-word accuracy, unless perhaps she has reasons for wanting to conceal certain details about the linguist's daughter I mentioned. The conference room becomes a pressure chamber, where every breath feels laden with the weight of consequences about to unfold, and I can see Constantine's hand moving slowly toward the weapon I know he keeps holstered beneath his jacket. And I realize that the careful plan we constructed over 2 weeks of preparation is disintegrating in real time, and that I have approximately 30 seconds to either salvage this situation or watch it explode into violence that will likely kill everyone in this room. "You are absolutely correct, Mr. Beslin," I say in flawless Chechen, abandoning pretense and stepping fully into the truth, because sometimes the only way forward is through the fire rather than around it. And I apologize for the imprecise translation, but the reason I omitted certain details is because I am the linguist's daughter you have been searching for. And I deliberately mistranslated your words just now because I wanted to hear you discuss my family's murder while looking you in the eyes, and knowing that you have no idea you are sitting across from the one person who survived your attempt to erase everyone who knew what my father discovered about your organization. The silence that follows my confession is so absolute that I can hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, can hear the almost inaudible sound of safeties being released on weapons throughout the room, can hear Constantine's sharp intake of breath as he realizes that I have just detonated a bomb that will reshape everything we thought we understood about this meeting and its purpose. Beslin's face transforms from suspicion into something that might be shock, or might be grudging respect. And when he speaks again, his voice carries a quality I have never heard before, something almost like admiration for an opponent who has proven more formidable than anticipated. "Then it appears we have both been operating under false pretenses," he says slowly, his hand also moving toward his weapon while his guards take positions that suggest the conference room is about to become a battlefield. And I find myself genuinely curious about how the daughter of the man I killed has managed to position herself as the translator for one of New York's most powerful crime bosses, and whether Mr. Volkov is aware that he has been harboring the very person I have spent 3 years and considerable resources trying to locate and eliminate. Constantine stands with fluid grace that belies the explosive violence I know he is capable of unleashing, and when he speaks, his voice carries the absolute certainty of someone who has just made a decision that will irrevocably alter the landscape of power in this city. "I have known exactly who Isla is since the night she translated your contract," he announces, and I feel my world tilt because this revelation means he has been manipulating this situation far more comprehensively than I understood, has been using my desire for vengeance to serve his own purposes in ways I am only beginning to comprehend. And I have spent the past weeks allowing her to believe we were building toward your destruction together, when in reality, I have been using her knowledge and her skills to construct a trap so perfect that you walked into it willingly, bringing your entire command structure with you to a location that I control, where every exit is monitored and every possible escape route has been sealed, and where the linguistic prodigy you have been hunting is about to provide testimony that will destroy not just your organization, but every network you have spent decades building on the foundation of murder and corruption. The world fragments into chaos as Beslin's men reach for their weapons with the synchronized precision of trained soldiers. But Constantine's crew is faster because they have been preparing for this exact moment since the meeting was scheduled, and the conference room erupts into violence that I watch, with the strange detachment of someone who has already accepted that survival is not guaranteed, but vengeance might still be possible even if I do not live to witness its completion. Constantine pulls me behind him with one hand while drawing his weapon with the other, and the gesture of protection should feel patronizing or dismissive, but instead feels like the physical manifestation of the partnership we have forged over these past weeks. the acknowledgement that we are stronger together than we could ever be separately, and that my value extends far beyond my linguistic skills into something more fundamental about trust and shared purpose. The exits are sealed, Konstantin announces in Russian that carries across the gunfire with the absolute authority of someone who controls not just this room, but the entire building and everyone in it. And FBI agents are positioned on every floor waiting for my signal to enter and take custody of everyone present. Because you see, Beslan Isla has spent the past 2 weeks providing federal prosecutors with translations of every communication you have ever sent, every deal you have ever made, every crime you have orchestrated over the past decade. And she has done so with such meticulous accuracy that your conviction is not a possibility, but rather an absolute certainty that will see you spending the rest of your life in a supermax prison, where you will have decades to contemplate the mistake of underestimating the daughter of the man you murdered. I watch Beslan's expression transform from arrogant confidence into the dawning comprehension of someone who has just realized that every move he made was anticipated. Every decision he thought was strategic was actually herding him toward this precise moment of reckoning. And the satisfaction I feel is so intense it borders on physical pleasure. A vindication 3 years in the making, finally crystallizing into reality. You orchestrated all of this, Beslan says to me in Chechen, his weapon lowering slightly as he understands that fighting is futile when the building is surrounded and his escape routes have been eliminated. The translation work, the positioning yourself with Volkov, the careful accumulation of evidence. You spent 3 years hiding, and then you spent weeks building the perfect trap using the one skill your father gave you, turning language itself into a weapon that I could not defend against because I never imagined a translator could be so dangerous. My father believed that language could prevent wars and protect innocence. I reply in the same dialect, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. But you taught me that language can also deliver justice when the legal systems fail. That words documented with sufficient precision become chains that bind criminals more effectively than any physical restraints. And that the daughter of a murdered linguist can honor her family's memory by ensuring that their killer faces consequences that are proportionate to the devastation he inflicted. Konstantin signals his men to lower their weapons as the sound of boots on stairs announces the arrival of federal agents who pour into the conference room with the overwhelming force of a government apparatus finally mobilized against targets who have evaded accountability for too long. And I watch as Beslan and his entire command structure are surrounded and restrained with efficient professionalism that speaks to months of preparation beyond even what Konstantin and I had orchestrated. Miss Morvan, a woman in an FBI jacket, addresses me with the respect accorded to someone who has provided invaluable cooperation. We need you to come with us to provide formal testimony and to verify the translations you have submitted, and I want to assure you that you will be placed in witness protection immediately following the conclusion of the prosecution, with a new identity and sufficient resources to build whatever life you choose in whatever location feels safest. The offer of witness protection should feel like salvation, like the promise of finally being able to stop running and hiding and looking over my shoulder for threats that might materialize from my past. But instead it feels like another form of erasure, another way of making Isla Morvan disappear into a series of carefully constructed lies and fabricated backgrounds. And I realize with startling clarity that I am exhausted from hiding, from pretending to be less than I am, from allowing fear to dictate the boundaries of my existence. I appreciate the offer, I say carefully, my eyes finding Konstantin across the room, where he stands watching this exchange with an intensity that suggests he already knows what I am about to say. But I am declining witness protection because I have spent 3 years being invisible, and I have discovered that survival without purpose is not actually living, and I would rather face whatever threats might emerge from my testimony than disappear again into an identity that requires me to forget who I am and what I have accomplished. The FBI agent starts to protest, to explain the very real dangers of remaining visible after providing evidence against organizations that specialize in retribution. But Konstantin crosses the room with predatory grace and places himself beside me in a gesture of solidarity that speaks louder than any verbal declaration. She will not require government protection, he announces with the absolute confidence of someone who has built an empire on the foundation of keeping his people safe, because she will be under the protection of the Volkov organization, and I guarantee that anyone who attempts to harm her will discover that retribution flows in multiple directions, and that the cost of targeting someone I have claimed as mine is higher than any rational person would be willing to pay. His use of the word mine should irritate me or trigger resistance against being claimed like property. But instead I feel something warm unfurling in my chest because I understand he is not claiming ownership, but rather offering partnership. The promise that I will never again face threats alone, because I have earned a place in his world through competence and courage and the willingness to weaponize my skills in service of justice. The weeks that follow Beslin's arrest blur together in a succession of depositions and court appearances and media coverage that transforms me from invisible waitress into the linguistic prodigy who brought down an international criminal network. And I discover that being seen is both terrifying and liberating, that stepping out of the shadows means accepting scrutiny, but also means claiming space in the world that I had convinced myself was too dangerous to occupy. Constantine keeps his promise of protection with a thoroughness that borders on obsessive, assigning guards and implementing security protocols, and making it absolutely clear to every organization that might consider me a target that the cost of touching me would be the complete annihilation of their operations. And I find myself falling into a routine where I continue translation work for his organization, but now openly, without the pretense that I am anything other than exactly who I am, the daughter of a murdered linguist who has chosen to honor her father's legacy by ensuring that language serves justice rather than enabling corruption. On the night that Beslin's conviction is announced, guilty on 47 counts that will ensure he dies in prison, Constantine finds me standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city spread out below like a constellation of possibilities. And when he speaks, his voice carries a gentleness I have learned to recognize as authentic rather than performed. "You could leave now," he says quietly, moving to stand beside me so that our reflections merge in the glass. "You have your vengeance, your family has been honored, and you have sufficient money and skills to build any life you choose anywhere in the world. So tell me why you are still here translating documents for a criminal organization when you could be teaching linguistics at a university, or working for the United Nations, or pursuing any number of respectable careers that do not involve association with people like me." I turn to face him fully, this beautiful, dangerous man who saw through my disguises and called forth the version of myself I had buried beneath 3 years of fear and hiding. And I realize that the answer to his question is simultaneously simple and impossibly complex, rooted in the understanding that sometimes the people we are supposed to avoid are actually the people who help us become who we were always meant to be. "I am here because you taught me a vocabulary I did not know I needed to learn," I tell him, reaching up to touch his face with the same gentleness he has shown me in moments when the world was not watching. The language of claiming space instead of apologizing for existing, of transforming grief into purpose, of refusing to let fear dictate the boundaries of possibility. And I have discovered that the most accurate translation of what my heart is trying to express is not found in Russian or Chechen or any of the 12 languages I speak fluently, but rather in the universal dialect of choosing to stay with someone who has seen every version of you and somehow decided that all of them are worth protecting. He pulls me into his arms with the fierce tenderness of someone who has learned that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but rather complementary forces that create something more powerful than either could achieve alone. And when he kisses me, it tastes like promises being made in the only language that transcends words, the language of two damaged people who have found in each other not salvation, but rather the courage to stop hiding from their own capacity for darkness and light in equal measure. "Then stay, Princessa," he whispers against my lips with an intensity that feels like vows being spoken in a ceremony attended only by the city lights, and our shared understanding of what it means to choose each other despite and because of everything we have survived. and I will spend the rest of my life learning to speak fluently, in whatever language your heart requires, translating my devotion into actions that prove worthy of the trust you have placed in a man who probably does not deserve you but who will fight to earn that worthiness every single day we have together. And so I stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have finally found somewhere I want to be, with someone who understands that the most important translations are not the ones that convert words between languages, but rather the ones that transform pain into purpose, isolation into connection, and the carefully constructed lies we tell ourselves about who we are into the liberating truth of who we might become, when we finally stop hiding and start living in the full, dangerous, beautiful complexity of our authentic selves, fluent at last in the language of becoming, rather than the language of merely surviving.